In this video, we're reviewing A Cellarful of Noise, the autobiography of Brian Epstein, the Beatles manager who died in 1967. We'll explore the most fascinating stories from Brian's unique perspective on the boys, and also dive into the controversial aspects of his personality that were excluded from the book, including his homosexuality at a time when it was still illegal in Britain, and also his drug use, which ultimately led to the Beatle manager's death. I'll also recommend some further reading and resources you might enjoy, including information about an upcoming biopic on Brian Epstein. So stay tuned. Hello and welcome back to the channel. My name is Charles Bliss and I'm a psychedelic journalist from Norwich, UK. If you're new here, I make videos about the Beatles, psychedelics and death as I write the manuscript for my first book. This video is the second episode in a new series which will analyse and summarise classic works of Beatles literature. If you're a Beatlemaniac, please subscribe and hit the bell icon to get notified every time I upload new videos about the Beatles bibliography. Let's go buy some records in 1960s Liverpool. At 3 p.m. on Saturday the 28th of October 1961, a young man from Knotty Ash called Raymond Jones walked into the North End Music Store's record shop in Whitechapel, Liverpool. "There's a record I want," he said. "It's my Bonnie, and it was made in Germany. Have you got it?" Brian Samuel Epstein, the 27-year-old director of the store, shook his head and asked who it was by. "You won't have heard of them," Jones said. "It's by a group called the Beatles." Nems had made its reputation as one of the most successful record stores in the north of England, thanks to its customer guarantee that if the store did not have a disc that a customer wanted in stock, no matter how obscure, it would procure it for them. Brian took note of Jones's request, writing on a pad, "My Bonnie by the Beatles. Check on Monday." This humble request would prove to be a catalyst for profound upheaval, not just in Brian's life, but in the history of popular culture. By walking into that Nems store on an autumnal afternoon, Jones set into motion a series of events that would change the world, like a butterfly beating the dust off its wings and triggering a hurricane. Brian said that he never paid any mind to the Liverpool beat groups because he was much older than the predominantly teenage demographic that followed the local music scene, and because he was occupied running a business. He writes, "The name Beatle meant nothing to me, though I vaguely recalled seeing it on a poster advertising a university dance at New Brighton Tower, and I remembered thinking it was an odd and purposeless spelling. But it seems unlikely that he never would have heard of the Beatles, as they featured regularly in the pages of Merseybeat, a musical publication which Brian sold in the store and which he regularly contributed record reviews. The Beatles also hung out in the Nems store in their leather jackets, chatting up the female shop assistants. But evidently there was something memorable about the group, and a further request for My Bonnie from two teenage girls a few days after Jones's visit inspired Epstein to decide to watch the Beatles perform live. Raymond Jones was one of any average dozen customers who called in daily for unknown discs, and there seems now no valid reason why, beyond my normal efforts to satisfy a customer, I should have gone to such lengths to trace the actual recording artists. But I did, and I wonder sometimes whether there is not something mystically magnetic about the name Beatle. In fact, the particular record that Jones had requested did not even feature the word Beatle on it. The record was a Scottish ballad adapted into a rampant twist beat by Tony Sheridan and the Beat Brothers, recorded in Hamburg with John, Paul, George and Pete Best as the backing group to Tony Sheridan, a guitarist and singer who incidentally is from the fine city of Norwich, where I live. Epstein paid a visit to the Cavern Club on Matthew Street to watch the Beatles perform on Thursday the 9th of November 1961. I arrived at the greasy steps leading to the vast cellar and descended gingerly past a surging crowd of Beat fans to a desk where a large man sat examining membership cards. He knew my name and he nodded to an opening in the wall, which led into the central of the three tunnels which make up the rambling cavern. Inside the club, it was as black as a deep grave, dank and damp and smelly, and I regretted my decision to come. Despite his initial hesitance, Brian was blown away by the boys' performance in the sweaty subterranean atmosphere of the Cavern Club, and before long he offered to represent them as the Beatles' manager. The rest, as they say, is history. The book was written in 1964, when Brian was just 29 years of age. In the author's note at the beginning of the book, Brian addresses how strange it might be to some that he had already tried to write his autobiography before he had reached the age of 30, a testament to the incredible life that he had led in such a short time. I wanted to put down at an early stage an accurate account of the emergence of the Beatles, and others from my point of view. So much has been said that is exaggerated, inaccurate, extravagant, and open to misinterpretation that I thought that a detailed account could only help, and I hope, prove of considerable public interest. Despite having a momentous life that was worthy of the publication of an autobiography by such a young age, Brian claims that he was a late bloomer. I must surely be one of the latest developers of all time, for not until my mid-20s did any pattern or purpose emerge in my life. If Keats had waited as long as I did to get going, he wouldn't have written more than a couple of poems before his death. He also says, "It's not impossible that, having smugly written an account of the advent of so many successful discs, my luck may change." The previous two statements would prove to be prophetic, though the manner in which Brian's luck changed was far more significant than record sales. Brian Epstein died of an accidental barbiturate overdose on the 27th of August, 1967. If he hadn't written this book at the height of Beatlemania and before his untimely demise, the world would never have gotten the inside story of the foursome that turned the world upside down. The book details Brian's middle-class Jewish upbringing and childhood, including his painful experiences moving between schools as an adolescent and his national service in the Royal Army Service Corps. Brian claims that he was surely the lousiest soldier in the world, and was even charged with impersonating an officer before he was dismissed early on psychological grounds. It also explores his failed attempt to become an actor, including his period studying at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art in London. He talks about the strain that his distracted attention had on his parents, Harry and Queenie Epstein, who supported his whims as he tried to discover his path in life. His father eventually put Brian in charge of the Whitechapel store, where he excelled in business as a salesman before his path crossed with the Fab Four. When he first met the Beatles, Brian was primarily a fan of classical music, but that soon changed after his exposure to the blistering rock and roll reverberating off the brick walls of the Cavern Club. My favourite composer in those days was Sibelius, but in these changing times, he is now placed in my affections alongside Paul McCartney and John Lennon. There's a lovely little episode which fans of the film A Hard Day's Night will recognise with amusement. Shortly after Brian started managing the Beatles, he arranged a meeting for them all to attend one morning, but Paul McCartney didn't show up. He instructed George Harrison to call Paul at home and find out why he was absent. George returned from the phone with a half smile, which annoyed me a little, and said, "Paul's just got up and he's having a bath." I said, "This is disgraceful, he's very late." And George, with his slow lopsided smile, said, "And very clean."
He's a nice old man, isn't he? He's very clean.
Brian wrote the book with Derek Taylor, the ghostwriter and a journalist who would go on to become the Beatles' press officer, and also he headed up the publicity department at Apple Corps in the late 60s. As with many books about the Beatles, A Cellarful of Noise was out of print for a long time, but it was recently republished by Souvenir Press, which is an imprint of profile books. This edition includes an introduction by Craig Brown, the author of 1, 2, 3, 4, The Beatles in Time, which was recently published and is getting a lot of good reviews. It also features reproductions of documents like the letter Brian received after being discharged by the army, and the original Beatles contract, as well as more than 30 black and white photographs of Brian and his artistes, including the Beatles, Cilla Black, Billy J. Kramer, and Jerry and the Pacemakers. To me, the most eye-opening elements of the book are Brian's real-time reactions to the Beatles' unprecedented success. At all stages of the Beatles' career, I and they seem to have reached what we believe to be the ultimate. First of all, it was the recording contract with EMI, way back in 1962. This, to us, was the greatest thing that could happen. Then it was the success of their first record, but this of course was only the beginning. The next ultimate was the number one position of Please Please Me. There could be, we believe then, nothing more important or dramatic or thrilling than to be number one in the British record charts. But one goes on, and, with the qualities of the Beatles, upwards and upwards. And our next high spot was the first appearance on Sunday night at the London Palladium, the top television show in Europe. So what's left? Came November 1963, and the Beatles were selected for the Royal Variety Show before the Queen Mother, another ultimate. But this was only the beginning. As the Beatles were performing in Paris in 1963, a telegram arrived that would shoot their fame into the stratosphere. I remember very well the night earlier that month in Paris, when a cable arrived from New York which said simply, Beatles number one in Cashbox record chart, New York, with I Want to Hold Your Hand. It was time to break America, and this is when Brian says it started to truly get out of control. If there was a turning point in their career, a specific date on which the breadth and scope of their future was to be altered, then it was the day their Pan-American Clipper touched down at John F. Kennedy Airport in New York, to a welcome which has seldom been equalled anywhere in history. Nobody, certainly not me, though my optimism was persistent from the very start, could have foreseen the excitement and the drama and the incredible curiosity aroused by the arrival on American soil of these four long-haired lads from Liverpool. From here on out, it was Beatlemania everywhere they went. And another fascinating feature of the book is Brian's executive view on how this hysteria that they inspired threatened the safety and security of the fans, the police, and the Beatles themselves. In Newcastle, and this was typical, nearly 4,000 Beatle fans had queued in freezing conditions for tickets. Said the Telegraph, it looked more like a death watch than the prelude of a joyous Beatle event. 3 ambulances, rarely short of patients, some of them schoolgirls, dealt with more than 100 cases of fainting or exhaustion. Several were treated at hospital. 74 police were on duty, and special checkpoints had to be set up. Happy and gay though they are, teenagers milling in their thousands around town halls and hotels and theatres would kill the Beatles if they got their hands on them. Fans unleashed on one of their idols would be murderous. This is why the apparent imprisonment of the Beatles is essential. But even when they were not locked up in their hotel suites, the Beatles still faced threats to their safety while performing. The Beatles run other risks. The more obvious ones are on stage in the worldwide barrage of jelly beans, pennies, toys, autograph books, and indeed, anything throwable. Paul was nearly blinded once by a safety pin. George took a sharp knock in Hong Kong when a silver dollar struck him on the ear. Thus are the many demonstrations of love manifested violently. Brian sums up the boys with one sentence that would resonate with any Beatlemaniac. For John, Paul, George and Ringo are themselves the ultimate superlative. This is something that the Beatles scholar Mark Lewison would certainly agree with. In Tune In, the first volume of his epic 3-part biography All These Years, Mark Lewison claims that the Beatles are a genuine ultimate, indisputably the biggest and best rock and roll band in the history of popular music. Epstein writes, I believe that there is something a little outside our normal experience in the happening of the Beatles, and I believe it is valuable to make the point. It may be magic, or it may be some strange organic combination. Whatever it is there. And it goes far beyond Twist and Shout or She Loves You. John, Paul, George and Ringo. Collectively, the 4 most famous names in the world. Extraordinary young men who have directly altered the lives of hundreds, even thousands of people, who have affected the entire balance of the entertainment industry, who have kicked up so much dust that in all our lifetimes it will not completely settle. One of the shortcomings of the book as an autobiography is how it sidesteps any mention of Brian's homosexuality, which was a core part of his personality. Brian was internally tortured by his sexuality, which he hid from the world as he engaged in what is called rough trade, which involved clandestine meetings with men in public toilets, which often resulted in him being beaten to a pulp or even blackmailed. In April 1957, Brian was arrested for soliciting an undercover police officer in London. This omission is completely understandable though, especially when we consider that homosexuality was still illegal in the 1960s, and in fact it wasn't made legal until 1967, a short time before Brian's untimely death. Brian's homosexuality was also omitted from Hunter Davies' authorised biography of the Beatles, published the year after Brian's death, in order not to upset Brian's mother, Queenie. John Lennon allegedly said that the book should have been called A Cellarful of Boys, in reference to Brian Epstein's homosexuality, and others have claimed that it was in fact a physical and sexual attraction that drew Brian to the Beatles in the first place, although personally I feel that this greatly oversimplifies his impulses. Their sex appeal is clearly an element of many fans' adoration of the boys, but it's clear from Brian's writing and also from the way that he conducted himself as the Beatles manager that he cared for each of them deeply and just wanted to share them with the world. The book also sidesteps Epstein's drug use. It was John Lennon who first introduced Brian to stimulants like Preludin, which would lead Lennon to feel partly responsible for Brian's early demise. Lennon said, "I introduced him to pills, which gives me a guilt association for his death." Brian's use of amphetamines and barbiturates fueled his management of the Beatles, and so with no mention of them, this will always be an incomplete picture. Although it is worth noting that since this book was published in 1964, this was before his drug use had spiraled out of control, like it did between 1965 and 1967, which ultimately culminated in the Beatle manager's accidental overdose and death at the age of 32. I'm going to give A Cellarful of Noise a rating of 2 out of 4. Any Beatle fan would appreciate how valuable this book is as a primary source that offers Brian's unique perspective on the Beatles' success. While each Beatle is obviously different, there were 4 of them, which meant that it was a shared, if unhinged, experience for them. But there was only one Brian, and if he was, as Paul McCartney has claimed, the 5th Beatle, then his story is a singular one that no other person can truly understand or empathise with. He was the closest one to all 4 of the boys, and oversaw their transition from a local rock and roll group into the world's biggest band in 6 short years before his death. But Brian was much more than just a manager. He was also their confidant, a father figure, and their biggest fan. And what comes across so beautifully in this book is Brian's love of the Beatles, first and foremost, as people. The reason I'm not giving it a higher rating is because if we want a more comprehensive picture of Brian's personality, we would need an exploration of his sexuality, which was such a fundamental component of his character. If you're interested in Brian's story, my recommendation would be to read one of the biographies about him, such as Ray Coleman's The Man Who Made the Beatles, an intimate biography of Brian Epstein. Also, an upcoming biopic about Brian, directed by Sarah Sugarman and called Midas Man, is in production, so keep on the lookout for the film's release date, which should be announced soon. I'll be making an obituary video on Brian Epstein in the future, diving deeper into his personality, his drug use, and his sexuality, to find out what happened to the Beatles manager who died at the age of just 32. If you enjoyed this video, you might like to check out my review of Love Me Do, The Beatles' Progress by Michael Brown, the first book ever published on the Beatles, which offers a fascinating insight into the phenomenon of Beatlemania. Next up in the book series is The Beatles, the authorised biography by Hunter Davies. So please subscribe and hit the bell icon to get notified every time I upload new videos on the Beatles bibliography. Peace.